Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar this morning from Miller Johnson. We're excited and pleased to have you guys all here to join us on Monday as we look at another one of these executive orders from Governor Whitmer in Michigan. So I have here, I'm Steve Van Stempvoort, and I have here with me Amy Murphy and Jim Peterson. We're all from the litigation section here at Miller Johnson. And we're going to be talking especially about the extended stay-at-home order that was issued on Friday. And then there are also a couple other things that we'll be discussing today as well. So this slide that you can see right here, this is essentially what we're going to be covering. We'll have other items that we'll discuss throughout. The first thing we'll talk about is the Executive Order 2020-59. This is the extended stay-at-home order. We'll touch on 2020.60. This is specifically related to food selling establishments. And then we'll talk a little bit about some updates on the latest legislative activity that is taking place in response to some of these extensions. So without further ado, why don't I ask Amy and Jim if you guys can introduce yourselves, and then we'll get this discussion underway.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. Amy Murphy here. I'm a litigator at Miller Johnson and have been pleased to be able to work with Jim and Steve as we go through what is now round 3 of the stay-at-home orders in Michigan.
Yes, good morning. Thanks, Steve and Amy. Jim Peterson. I work in the litigation section at Miller Johnson and have for over 30 years now, and had to become an expert in the various shelter-in-place or stay-at-home orders for the last, well, that's more than a month now.
Thanks, folks. And again, I'm Steve Van Stempvoort, also in the litigation section here at Miller Johnson. So Executive Order 2020.59 extends it until, the extension is now until May 15. It used to be April 1. And there have been certain changes. There have been some things that have changed, some things have stayed the same. The main thing that has changed in terms of a time perspective is that it now lasts until May 15, as indicated. But there also are certain relaxations in the types of businesses that are permitted to remain open or permitted to resume operations. And Jim, can you just give us a quick update on what's going on here? I understand that there's some, obviously the critical infrastructure designations, et cetera, are still there, but now there's a new category of businesses that are able to remain open or able to resume operations. Can you give us a quick overview of that?
Sure. So in Section 10 of the new order, Order 59, the governor relaxed the restrictions to enable certain operations to conduct in-person operations, including garden stores, nurseries, lawn care, pest control, and landscaping in particular. Those industries were putting a fair amount of pressure either through litigation or through lobbying efforts to be allowed to open because the spring is so critical to their businesses. In addition to those, the order also allows workers who perform bicycle maintenance or repair, and also those who work at golf courses, workers for moving and storage operations, and then lastly, the workers who process or fulfill remote orders for goods for delivery or curbside pickup, which could be viewed very broadly.
Amy, can you jump on that last minute, the last point that Jim made? The Section 10A of this particular executive order talks about how a company can resume operations for processing and fulfilling orders. How broadly can that be read? Does it apply to any manufacturing company, or is it more limited to retail? What do we think?
So none of us has a crystal ball, of course, but we are able to see from other provisions in the order what we think is the intent behind Governor Whitmer's inclusion of this 10A provision allowing for remote orders to be fulfilled, processed and fulfilled for delivery or curbside pickup. We think she probably intended that to be things like retail goods, that, you know, a customer could come to the curb next to your business and pick up a delivery in the same way that many of us have been picking up food deliveries, or pick up a food order, rather. That said, the language is pretty broad, and we actually got a question on this before the webinar got started, someone asking that the question about whether a manufacturing plant could produce parts and ship orders to its customers under this provision, because that would be, you know, fulfilling a remote order for goods for delivery. You know, the language is broad, but we do think that the intent was probably, or perhaps, I don't know that we can say probably, but we think there's a possibility Governor Whitmer's intent was not to allow something so broad. That said, you know, the language certainly invites this question, and we would probably think there's going to be some answer coming, maybe by way of an FAQ. As our listeners know, there have been FAQs posted on each of these executive orders. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something in the FAQs, though that we haven't seen anything yet, but something coming down the pike where the governor's office further refines what they meant by Section 10A. We would advise our clients who are thinking about whether they fit within this provision to give us a call. We'll talk through it with you. And I think it's possible that if you decided to operate under that provision as a manufacturing business or another business that maybe is in a bit of a gray area in regards to whether that clause applies to you, we wouldn't be surprised if you'll get a call or a visit from some law enforcement entity down the road who's wondering why you're operating, and we'd certainly be happy to help make the case for you. But given the way that the order, generally speaking, is framed, we think Governor Whitmer likely did not mean for the clause to be as broad as it is, but it's written the way it's written.
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, the order says what it says. Now, of course, Governor Whitmer, as Amy, you pointed out, she may try to clarify it later on with some responses to FAQs. But it is interesting that the language is potentially susceptible to a fairly broad interpretation. Of course, that's something that we've seen with all of these executive orders that we've been dealing with the last month or so, that sometimes the language isn't quite as clear as we might want or suspect should be, and that's led to some unclarity. Now, Amy, I know that you've been working with some golf courses about how they can resume operations and stuff. And so, do you want to just give us a quick discussion of what the latest advice about golfing or other recreational activity is?
Sure. So golf and also boating were added to the list of outdoor recreational activities that individuals are permitted to engage in, leave their home to go do, consistent with the social distancing requirements that we remain 6 feet apart from people outside of our individual households. And in Section 10, this section we've been discussing that involves these, businesses who are now able to resume activities, Section 10D allows places of outdoor recreation, including golf courses, to allow maintenance workers and groundskeepers to come back to work to do the work that's necessary for maintaining the safety and sanitation of those places of outdoor recreation. There's a limitation, though, so maintenance workers and groundskeepers can come back and work on your golf course to allow people to play golf, but they are not allowed to provide goods, equipment, supplies, or services to individuals. So as the avid golfers who are listening in probably noticed when this order came out, one of the headline news clips was that this was going to allow golf, but not golf carts. And that seems to be what that clause is doing, allowing your golf course workers to come back to provide maintenance and other sanitation and safety measures for the golf course, but you're not supposed to be giving out carts or other supplies and services. That said, an FAQ was added to the web page that contains all the FAQs on this latest 2259 executive order. And that FAQ even goes into greater detail about what golf courses should be doing. It does make an accommodation for golfers who have a disability and might need a cart, presumably. But the FAQ also discusses, some of the more nitty-gritty details about what a golf course should be doing if it's opening again. For example, food and beverage takeout services, according to the FAQ, that's permitted. But tee times and paying for your golf, your round of golf should be done online, according to the FAQ, or through some remote means.
Thanks, Amy. I mean, those details are critical for those of us who like to hit the links on the weekends or otherwise. Now, Jim, I understand that underneath the order, it requires employees who of operations that are resumed. Certain of those employees need to the employers need to abide by certain specific rules that keep the workplaces safe. And I know one of those rules that we've gotten a lot of questions about is the provision of face masks to employees. Can you discuss what employers need to do, whether employees need to be required to wear those face masks, what happens if an employer can't get a supply of face masks? What's the story there?
Sure. So under the new order, businesses are required to provide personal protective equipment such as gloves, goggles, face shields, and face masks as appropriate for the activity being performed. That is not the same as saying that employers are required to mandate that their employees actually use that personal protective equipment. The order does not say that, although they certainly should be encouraged to do that just for their own safety and the safety of other workers. Over the weekend, the Attorney General, probably in response to certain employers saying that they could not get personal protective equipment in order to provide that to their employees, issued a statement that said that good faith efforts would be recognized and encouraging law enforcement to not take enforcement action, and encouraging employers to have their employees use their own personal protective equipment and bring it with them in the event that they could not get it. And we've heard from several clients who have indicated that they're having a difficult time getting masks in particular.
Now, as far as workers who need to perform resumed activities under the order, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jim and Amy, but my understanding is that employers need to designate those workers in writing as workers who are necessary to maintain the resumed operations, just like their designations were made previously for critical infrastructure workers and minimum business operations workers. So those written
Correct.
designations should be made. Okay, good.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Are there any other specific things in terms of resumed activities that we need to make sure? I know that there are specific rules, for instance, about keeping in-person contact to a minimum, those sorts of things. Anything else in particular?
Well, so as before, the written designation can be done by website or email, and employees are not required to carry that designation with them. Law enforcement should not be requesting that to be shown, although there's certainly nothing wrong with them carrying that with them, and it may forestall some enforcement activity or make the answer to law enforcement questions easier.
One other thing I will add is a lot of the mitigation measures that the previous orders talked about did so with phrases like to the maximum extent possible or where feasible, which left a little bit of wiggle room where businesses, who couldn't feasibly keep people 6 feet apart, maybe could make an argument that they don't have to do so. The businesses that are resuming operations under this new order, your landscapers, your golf courses, your nurseries, there are some specific provisions other than providing PPE. There's some specific provisions about social distancing that where the language is more restrictive, more of a command than a request. One, for example, is that these businesses resuming activities should be barring gatherings of any size in which people can't maintain 6 feet of distance from one another. So that's a much stricter provision as compared to previous orders.
Yeah, that's a good point, Amy. Thanks for jumping in on that. Now, as far as obviously the order is more relaxed in certain instances, right? It allows certain operations to resume, relaxing some other restrictions. But there's also quite a bit that stays the same. The designations of workers who can be minimum business operations workers, that has remained the same. Designations of critical infrastructure workers, that has remained the same as well. The updated stay-at-home order specifically relies on the March 19 guidance from the Department of Homeland Security, what we call the CISA guidance. Even though that guidance has been updated twice, those new, more expansive versions of the guidance have not been incorporated in this extended stay-at-home order. And so, Jim, can you talk a little bit about what that means? I mean, my reading of that is that there are some industries who are still kind of out in the cold, right? Construction, for instance. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, so we don't know why the new executive order does not adopt the updated CISA guidance. What we know is that now twice in order number 42 and order number 59, Governor Whitmer specifically rejected the updated CISA guidance. And it really is construction that is one of the principal industries that is impacted by that rejection of the new guidance. The governor is reported to have a press conference this afternoon, and I know that many of our construction clients are very interested and think that she may address the construction industry in that. In her press conference last Friday, she specifically invited construction to submit plans as to how they could operate safely. And I know that that some construction clients have submitted those plans for the governor's review. And so I do expect that there may be a statement as to construction this afternoon, but they are definitely clamoring for some relief from the restrictions that the governor issued.
And Jim, on that note, I mean, my read of the governor's press conference and statements that she made was that she would, she actively requested input from businesses about how, and industries about how they can operate safely. And so it seemed to me that there's some glimmer that the conversation was changing a little bit from a question about what industries are essential, and that was changing to a conversation about what industries or operations can operate safely. And so it does seem to me that the conversation has changed somewhat from what it was in weeks past.
I think that's true, and I think that construction industry employers are at least cautiously optimistic that there may be some relief.
Amy, did you have anything to add on that? Or, I mean, the other question that we have under this extended order is the designations of critical infrastructure suppliers. Again, under the most recent versions of the order, including this one, critical suppliers can now self-designate. They don't have to wait for written permission from another operation to say, yes, you're critical to my critical infrastructure operations. And so now suppliers can self-designate. So you don't need to have a written designation, but is there any reason why those would still be helpful or useful? What's your take?
Yeah, what we've been finding is that the more our clients are able to document their decisions regarding why they are able, if they make the determination they're able to resume operations under any of these orders, documenting the decisions that they've made, why they're able to operate is useful in the off chance that we do have to have a discussion with law enforcement, or if an employer files a complaint with a local public health department and that leads to discussion with that county entity. So having a designation from your customer that you're a critical supplier can be useful for moving that conversation in the right direction and showing that the business is truly making the effort to stay apprised of what these now over 60 executive orders all do or possibly do to their operations, and comply in good faith, which is essentially we want to make sure our clients are able to say that they are complying in good faith with the order. So a designation in writing that you're a critical supplier, certainly not necessary anymore, but can be helpful in those law enforcement interactions. And in talking to your employees, right? So if your employees are worried about coming in, fearing for their health and safety, or have, other reasons for not wanting to show up to work, being able to say, here are major customers who are depending on us. That can be, helpful in moving the needle, getting them comfortable with the notion of coming back to work.
Right, and I think that a lot of this does cover multiple bases, right? Because you have the documentation that helps you in terms of compliance with the legal requirements, in case there's somebody that's knocking on your door in terms of law enforcement. But clearly, that sort of documentation, that sort of analysis and thought would also help the communication with your employees to be able to discuss with them and explain kind of the critical mission that your particular operations are involved in. And that has been, I think, very helpful for employers, especially to be able to have that discussion with the folks who are being required to come back in. Now, Jim, part of this also has to do with, when we talk about law enforcement, we talk about, compliance with the regulatory, I guess it's a legal regime now. Can you just give us a quick overview of kind of enforcement trends, discussions that you may have had or kind of things that you're seeing in terms of enforcement with this particular executive order, as well as the ones that immediately preceded it?
Sure. So I spent a fair amount of last week on telephone calls with either law enforcement officials, police, for example, and also with prosecuting attorneys or city attorneys who are being called by police officers asking for their interpretation of various situations involving in-person operations, and they're forced to deal with complaints. Sometimes complaints come from employees who don't believe that their employer is engaged in critical infrastructure, and so they'll call in a complaint which will be investigated. Other times we've had competitors call on companies to report their activities. But in all cases where I have spoken with law enforcement, they have emphasized that their primary goal is education and gaining compliance, and it is not on issuing citations. And in most of the cases where I was talking with law enforcement, they understood and accepted the explanation as to why the employer was conducting in-person operations and agreed that it was a critical infrastructure operation. I had one instance where a law enforcement official disagreed with me, but even in that instance, he said, I'm not going to take any enforcement action against this entity.
Right, and I think that's consistent with what we've seen for the past several weeks. Is that there's been a fairly light touch in terms of law enforcement. Mostly the local folks, local law enforcement agencies are the ones who are responding to complaints or phone calls, and they've been fairly responsive to the explanations of our clients, and it's been good to see. Amy, do you have anything else on Executive Order 2020-59 before we move over to number 60 for a few minutes?
Sure. So I've noticed we've gotten a couple more questions about masks, and in particular the interaction between the parts of the order that require individuals to wear masks in enclosed public space, and the way that clause interacts with the other clause requiring businesses as of today to start providing face coverings to their workers. Steve, do you want to address that a little bit more? I think we've gotten some questions about, if you're required to wear a mask, doesn't that mean that an employer needs to make sure you're wearing one, or does it not? And a question about, in office settings where there's perhaps minimal staff, do you really need to be wearing a mask, or if you're the employer providing a mask?
Yeah, well, sure. I can give you my take. So clearly there is that provision in, I think it's 15A in the new executive order that requires individuals to wear a mask in any enclosed public space. Now, those terms aren't defined there, but the way we've been reading that is that an enclosed public space, that includes spaces that are open to the public generally. So typically you're looking at retail, the grocery store or hardware store, something like that, where customers can still come inside, on premises and purchase things. That would be an example of a place where an individual would need to wear a face mask. If you're a manufacturing facility, for instance, and your floor, you've got workers on the floor, that would not be an enclosed public space. That's at least my reading of this. And Jim and Amy, you can disagree with me if you want. But my reading of that is that is not an enclosed public space. That's a workplace, right? That's not something where the general members of the public are going to be coming in. Workers in that space are not required to wear face masks. The order does require employers to make face masks available to them and to provide other protective equipment as necessary or as reasonable under circumstances. So it could include additional items of PPE, for instance, goggles or gloves, etc. But I do not think that the order requires face mask wearing within a workplace that is not also a public space. So an office environment, for instance, again, the employer would have to make the masks available and provide them, and probably, it's probably good practice to recommend to employees that they should wear them, but I do not think it's a requirement under the order. It's not a requirement that the employees actually wear them. You don't have to coerce or force your employees to wear them in a non-public workspace. And Jim and Amy, if you have other thoughts on that, I'd welcome them.
No, I completely agree with your analysis, Steve, and I think our advice to clients has been along those lines, but as Steve said, to suggest that it's probably the best practice to be encouraging your workers to wear the masks, if they can. But certainly the order is not saying a business has to go around policing its workers and making sure that they do it. Now, if you adopt a policy under your COVID-19 preparedness and response plan and say we want our workers wearing those masks, then, to keep that plan kind of in force and show that you're taking the plan seriously, you'd probably want to be following your own policy on that. And that plan, like in the last executive order number 42, that plan is necessary for any business that's operating right now. So having a COVID-19 preparedness and response plan is an essential item if you're thinking about reopening.
Jim, do you have any final thoughts on Executive Order 59 before we move quickly to 60?
Just one other piece of good news there is that it does allow in-state travel between two residences now. So people who have second homes or cottages are allowed to travel between those residences now. Although the governor did discourage that, it is not prohibited.
Yes, that is excellent for many of us. And we'll talk a little bit about legislative update on some of these matters after we hit 60, Executive Order number 60. But Amy, do you want to discuss Executive Order 60 here, because I know you've dealt directly with this in some circumstances.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. We wanted to touch briefly on this order because it came out shortly after number 59, obviously, and now we're on to, I think, 61 or 62 executive orders in Michigan under the COVID-19 era, which is remarkable compared to other states. But number 60 came out over the weekend and probably got a little less attention than number 59, at least initially. But I saw some news stories picking up on the importance of number 60 yesterday. It applies to food selling establishments and pharmacies. The big highlights, obviously, if you're in the business of selling food, and truly food selling establishment is broadly defined to include grocery stores, convenience stores, restaurants that sell groceries or food available for takeout, and any other business that sells food. So if you're in the business of selling food, make sure you look at Executive Order number 60. The couple of key provisions I wanted to make sure our listeners were aware of is that among these establishments, starting now, you need to implement a daily screening program, and that screening program will involve asking your employees questions either upon arrival to the work site or just before they report to the work site, asking about whether they have a fever, cough, shortness of breath, a sore throat, or diarrhea, and whether they've traveled internationally or outside of Michigan in the last 14 days, and whether they've had close contact with anyone in the last 14 days who's been diagnosed with COVID-19. And depending on the answers to those questions, the executive order describes how long employees who answer yes to some of those questions or any of those questions have to be excluded from the work site. Some of that lines up with a previous executive order, 2020-36. So I would read those two in conjunction. The other provisions of this order that strike me as things we want to make sure our clients in this food selling realm are aware of. So one is that you make accommodations for your employees who are among the vulnerable populations, that people with pre-existing conditions, for example, that make them immunocompromised, perhaps. So for those employees, you have to take certain steps to accommodate them. Either find some work activity they can be doing that involves lower exposure potential to COVID-19, or allowing them to take unpaid leave. And then another important provision, perhaps not surprising, is this order is requiring businesses in the food selling world to eliminate any stations where either people can serve themselves food or sample and taste food. So no samplings, no free tastings during the pandemic. There are many other measures that the order addresses, so I won't hit on all of them, but it's worth taking a look through this list. And of course, if you have questions, we'd be happy to help you work out a plan for complying with this order. This order went into effect immediately after signage on April 24th, and it's effective through May 22nd.
And this
Right.
one is different than 59, just in that employers of food selling establishment and pharmacies must require their checkout employees to wear coverings over their noses and mouths.
Yep, that's a good point.
I guess the other thing that this also brings up is that there are some counties I know in Michigan that have adopted more strict screening measures for their employees. So not just that apply not just to food sellers and pharmacies, but also to all other sorts of operations that are continuing to operate. And so some of these screening procedures may be kind of something that applies to other industries down the road, or perhaps in other counties, depending on your operations. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that is
so.
true, Steve. And I also believe that some employers are asking these screening questions, even if they're not allowed, just because they're interested in protecting the health and safety of their workers.
Yeah, I think we are aware of at least, I want to say there are at least 8 counties, and there could be more. I haven't done a thorough count recently, that requires some sort of employee screening for any establishment, for any business, not necessarily in the food and pharmacy realm. And then one other thing this makes me think of is the COVID-19 preparedness and response plan. I know the OSHA guidance that plan is supposed to be consistent with discusses the possibility of, it doesn't require, but the possibility that depending on your workforce and the exposure risk in your workplace, that you might want to implement such screening measures like Jim discussed. So even if you're not required to by any executive order at the state level or county specific order, you might want to do some sort of screening, and you could consider whether that screening should extend to frequent visitors if you have contractors on site or members of the public who come into your workplace from time to time. You might think about doing some sort of screening of them, or at least asking them some of the basic questions before they make a visit.
Right. I mean, none of us have the crystal ball here about what's going to come down the pike, but I can easily imagine a world in where some sort of screening procedures become de facto normative within certain industries, and perhaps even across industries, where operations that are maintaining in-person work with workers who are fairly close together likely going to be seeing screening of some sort of their employees and perhaps contractors, as you had indicated. The other thing that this makes me think of is, for those industries that are currently still shuttered and who need to kind of put together a case for the governor's office, et cetera, other public relations, for the proposition that they can continue to engage in work or resume their operations in a safe manner. It seems that this particular order kind of gives you a template for how to structure your proposal, right? I mean, it gives us a template for, the sorts of screening measures and other kind of sanitation measures that the governor would like to see in an industry that is maintaining or resuming in-person operations.
Yep, I agree with that. I think it's a good it's a good order to look to if you've got any retail sales going on, or transactions at a register, grocery carts or baskets, right? Thinking through all of the points of contact between employees and customers, or customers and customers, and how you should be cleaning those areas and, taking other steps to mitigate the risk of exposure.
Let's jump to the next, kind of the final item that we wanted to talk a little bit about. This is just on the kind of the legislative response to some of these orders. Excuse me. And Amy, do you want to just give us an overview of what's going on in the legislature? I know the Senate passed some measures on Friday and tried to create a committee. Can you give us some details about that?
Yeah, sure. So there has been a little bit of a sign of some tug of war between the governor and the Michigan legislature over Governor Whitmer's response to COVID-19 and the executive orders that she's been issuing. This has been, weeks in the process. The legislature has been trying to gain greater input into the process. And so on Friday, there was a resolution that passed to create an oversight committee. I think it has, I think there are 9 members on that committee, members from both parties, who are going to be tasked with assessing Governor Whitmer's response. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some recommendations that go kind of in line with what we were seeing in the past week or week and a half that built up to this latest executive order, where the discussions around businesses who are able to start safely reopening and safely operating, as opposed to making a distinction between businesses that are critical and businesses that are not, but a broader swath of businesses that may not fall into the critical designation but could reopen safely, I think will be a major topic that the Oversight Committee concerns itself with, and putting forward probably, with the help of public health experts, arguments for broadening the list of businesses that start resuming their activities. And then the Michigan Senate passed legislation attempting to curtail the governor's powers during a state of emergency. There are a couple of statutes that grant her fairly broad emergency powers, and the Senate proposed, the bill would curtail that and would repeal one of the laws which dates back to 1945 and arguably is the broadest authority for the governor to be taking measures during an emergency like these executive orders, to pretty broad emergency power. So without a timeline or without a deadline, without a need to consult the legislature on a regular basis. That law or that legislation moved to the House, and we'll see whether the House takes it up. But I think there's a likelihood that we'll see some legislation pass. And Steve, what's your take on what happens at that point?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. Governor Whitmer has indicated that she will not sign any such bill that removes her emergency powers under the 1945 legislation. My strong suspicion is that she will, in fact, veto it. And, I just don't know. The makeup of the Michigan legislature would appear that the Republicans, to the extent that this is a partisan issue and breaks down on partisan lines, it would appear that the Republicans do not have a veto-proof supermajority. So my suspicion is that things stay at the status quo, at least for the time being. And I guess, the question for both of you is, what are your thoughts on, let's assume that that this 1945 statute is not repealed. What's our prediction about a timeline here? How long is this going to last? How long are we going to be in kind of shelter-in-place territory? Jim, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the executive order number 59 is a pretty good indication that it's going to be at least until mid-May. But once again, the executive order does indicate that the governor is going to evaluate public health conditions and economic conditions in deciding whether to modify the terms of the order. And, you know, so far the governor has demonstrated that she prefers to address the changing circumstances on a piecemeal basis by issuing a new executive order rather than, I think, committing to something that is more broad. And so I would expect, I mean, as we've been on this webinar, we're up to 63 executive orders now. That there will be more between now and May 15.
Yeah, and I'll be interested, you know, Governor Whitmer did say that she was going to be joining with this Midwest coalition to move the region of the Midwest in one direction and have some, you know, relatively in sync orders perhaps that help the region to open up on a timeline that's somewhat similar. So I will be interested to see what Ohio does. I think Governor DeWine is going to be offering some details on his plan for Ohio reopening, and I could see that having some effect on Governor Whitmer.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, and that's similar to my own thoughts about this. I mean, I'm somewhat more optimistic in terms of the prospect of industries being able to reopen on a basis of safety and kind of some more targeted analysis of particular operations, and that may allow for some more flexibility in terms of allowing certain operations that perhaps aren't deemed as essential as others. They may nevertheless still open. So I am somewhat optimistic just based on the conversation and the kind of the rhetoric that I've seen come out of the governor's office recently. It sounds like we're headed in that direction. We are running out of time here, so if we can advance the slides and we can just show obviously our contact information. If anybody out there has any questions, we've tried to answer many of the questions that have been submitted, and hopefully we've addressed some of them along the way. But if there are any other questions, obviously, please let us know. Our contact information is right there. Amy, Jim, and myself, we're happy to discuss these issues with you. And again, this is a rapidly changing field. We don't know what things are going to look like next week. As Jim suggested, we're likely going to see additional revisions to the executive orders, probably before they expire by their own terms. And so, you know, there undoubtedly will be additional questions coming up. And so we're happy to help you navigate those issues as they come up. Jim and Amy, you have any closing thoughts on this before we wrap it up?
No, I appreciate everyone's participation, and we'll do our best to keep you updated as things continue to change.
Yes, thank you for joining us on this Monday morning. We hope you have a good week and a safe week.
All right, thanks again, Jim and Amy, and thanks to everybody who participated. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.